everyone. Really excited to be here among such great speakers. My name is Kwame. I'm going to talk to you about managing product quality. Today my goal is really to inspire you to think differently about maintaining your software. And we're going to talk about how you can apply systems thinking principles to understand software behavior over time much better. So first, a little bit more about me. Previous experience, I've worked at a bunch of companies as an engineer, a tech lead, a manager. Right now I do independent leadership coaching and technical advising. A lot of the work in my career has been understanding what processes we're employing today and how effective they are. And over time, I've picked up a bunch of techniques that I'm going to share with you today. Today I'll be using a tool that I actually wrote or added to in preparation for this talk. Yes, I actually wrote software in preparation for this talk. So it's a tool for predicting system behavior. Nodes are amounts and quantities in the diagram that you see. Edges represent positive and negative correlations. Longer edges mean a delayed effect. And this is heavily based on a tool called Loopy that's used for systems thinking. You should look that up too. So the first principle I want to cover. Understanding systems fully allows you to find the greatest leverage points, which leads to greater impact. I'm going to share a quick story with you. Several years ago, I was responsible for optimizing homepage performance for Facebook. And I was managing the team that had the performance goal, while 10 plus other teams were actually committing code to the homepage, and they just had engagement goals. It was a really interesting experience. So when I first joined the team, my mental model for homepage performance looked something like this. So this is a technical problem. We have some tech debt. We land a bunch of optimizations, and we'll hit our performance goal, right? Wrong. So after a while of thinking really deeply about this problem, chasing engineers, lobbying managers, and examining a pattern of performance regressions, my mental model exploded in complexity. So I began to see this problem as more a collection of feedback loops that span the technology stack and our culture. And in order to improve performance, we had to apply pressure to various parts of the system. So it wasn't just optimizations, it was things like tooling, documentation, t-shirts, and internal summit. All of these things, believe it or not, actually contributed to improving page load time. In retrospect, what I was actually doing was employing systems thinking. And reasoning about these various feedback loops helped me understand all of the factors that contributed to oscillations in page load times. Companies are really machines, right, with all of these interconnected parts. And if your company produces software, the purpose of that machine is really to deliver value to users. When we interact with these complex machines, depending on how we approach the problem, the solutions we try to land could have unintended side effects. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So most of the time, we employ what's called event-oriented thinking to reason about the world. But event-oriented thinking ignores the inherent interconnected nature of most companies. Employ event-oriented thinking, it's really easy to have a short-term effect on the system, right? But in the long term, you're ignoring the rest of the system. So whatever change you land is going to have some unintended consequences, most likely, at least if you're thinking about engineering problems. So if you're an engineer or a manager, you're encountering these causal feedback loops all the time. And the more senior you are in your career, whether you're a senior engineer or a tech leader or a manager, you should really be spending more time thinking about the system and less time thinking about local events. So my goal here isn't really to prescribe specific strategies that you can use. My goal is to share a mindset that I found really helpful in my career for teasing apart problems in different ways. Principle 2, working backwards from events to mental models helps you understand all of your options for manipulating a system's behavior. So we're going to talk about some straightforward techniques that you can use for sort of changing your frame of reference and using different approaches to understanding problems. So there are 4 different types of thinking I'm going to talk about, and they all build on each other. So I mentioned event-oriented thinking, and next we have trend-oriented thinking, which is just a pattern of events. Then we have system-oriented thinking, and the system is what gives rise to those trends. And then finally we have mental model-oriented thinking, and the mental model is what gives rise to the system. So as you tease the problem apart in different ways, as we go down this pyramid, you're having a greater level of impact overall. And let's talk about how that works. So event-oriented thinking. You ask yourself essentially what happened and how do I respond? Very simple. When you're operating at this level, again, you're having that short-term impact, but you're ignoring the rest of the system. And sometimes that's okay. If the site's down, you should just fix it, right? Trend-oriented thinking. You ask yourself, what is the pattern of events? What's likely to happen in the future? And how do we adapt? When you're operating at this level, you're probably landing some incremental change to the system, but we can do a lot better here. System-oriented thinking. How is the structure of the system guaranteeing the behavior I'm observing? And then how do we change the system to guarantee the behavior we desire? So at this level, you're playing around with the system. It could be technical, it could be social, it could be organizational, it could be something else. But the point is that you're trying to produce that sustained change in behavior as opposed to making that local change that may or may not work out the way that you want. So lots of you are probably very familiar with this, but there's one more level I want to talk about here, and that's mental model-oriented thinking. So what assumptions, beliefs, and values are giving rise to the system, and then what mental models do we need to adopt or discard to make sure that the structures that we know are healthy arise organically. When you're operating at this level, you're basically hacking directly on company culture, and this is really the highest leverage activity you can do. Because when you're hacking on culture, then you're basically making sure that the right structures appear everywhere. And you're not having to go around and examine the trends or tell people how to do their work. There's a shared understanding, and that's why it's so powerful. Now, to be clear, I just want to reiterate, I'm not saying you should always use mental model-oriented thinking. If the site's down, you shouldn't say, well, what mental models do we need to adopt to make sure the site comes back up, right? So it's really important to use that right mode of thinking, and oftentimes it's multiple modes. Principle 3, and this is the last principle. I'm going to walk through several examples here to apply the concepts we just talked about. So principle 3, employing systems thinking effectively helps you manage quality long term. So first example. A user has consistently complained about poor app performance, and you're responsible for investigating. What do you do? So let's try event-oriented thinking. What happened and how should I react? So you might dive in, figure out why it's slow. You found an unbounded query that only affects really big customers. You fix it after a week. Great, you made that customer really happy. You've unblocked them on a really urgent issue. And that is some impact, but in the long run, that's not that impactful, right? So how can we do better here? Trend-oriented thinking. What's the pattern and how can we adapt? You might spend a little bit more time trying to figure out where a similar failure is happening in your stack. So you dive in, you do that, you land a new abstraction that solves this problem in several different places. So now you've solved the original pain point for one customer and figured out how to address the pattern, which helps other customers who are in a similar boat. So you multiplied your impacts, but ultimately you'll probably hear about these issues in the future, right? You'll continue to encounter these issues and land fixes. So ultimately, I think we can still do a little bit better. So what about systems-oriented thinking? With this, you think about the structure of the system that would produce that pattern of perf regressions that you're seeing. So in this example, you realize that the perf cost per incremental feature is way too high due to some outdated architectural decisions. Most customers aren't suffering yet, but you realize what you're seeing is really just storm clouds on the horizon. And this could be a major block to your growth. So what you're seeing on the top left is a tight feedback loop between new features, customers, and revenue, right? So that encourages more new features. But then there's a longer feedback loop between page load time, quality, and revenue, right? So in the short term, we're incentivized to land all these features, and then we're kind of blindsided by all these quality issues. And this is what happens over time. This was a really successful product at first that was starting to get traction, and then all of a sudden it went into this death spiral. So this is actually an example of something called growth and underinvestment. This is a common pattern in systems, whether it's technical, social, any system you encounter may have some form of this. What's happening is that you have a feedback loop around a goal that you're trying to hit, but then there's another feedback loop, perhaps longer running, perhaps less visible, that's working against you. And then when your performance metrics start to suffer, you invest less time in trying to hit that goal, which hurts the performance metric even more, which leads to less invested time, and that is the cause of that death spiral. This is something that's happening at every single company, right? So I challenge you to go and look for this pattern and evaluate whether or not it's time to try to unblock growth. So let's see how we can do better in this particular system. The structural problem is that the company is not set up to remove those blockers to growth quickly enough. So in this case, the blocker is performance and overall quality of the product. So there are 3 changes we can make to this system. First, renewed emphasis on quality work, or increased emphasis. Second, a much tighter loop between quality work and load time. And the third thing is making sure product engineers are thinking about quality too. And this is actually a well-known fix to the growth and underinvestment problem, a tighter feedback loop basically a tighter feedback loop around that second loop that's countering your performance metric. And this is what happens over time in that system I just showed you. So that purple line that you're seeing is actually quality. So when it gets bad enough, basically you start working on it again, goes up and down, because that's the blocker to your growth. And the green line is actually customers and revenue. So now we've unblocked growth and it grows at a steady pace. Awesome. So that was systems-oriented thinking. So what if we use mental model-oriented thinking? You think about what mindsets leads to the system you're experiencing. One where performance work isn't being prioritized, maybe other quality work is being neglected too, and you realize that maybe the startup mentality you guys started with isn't working for you anymore. Maybe your culture is the real blocker to growth. Maybe you and your colleagues need to fundamentally rethink the way you're measuring your performance and investing your time. So again, when you're communicating at the level of mental models, your impact increases a lot, right? So we've gone from trying to optimize this architecture to trying to understand what about our culture is holding us back as a business, not just in tech, but everywhere, right? And this is an exercise that's happening every day at every company. So when we're using systems-oriented thinking, we talked about the ideal structure, which included sufficient investment, a tighter feedback loop, and awareness among product engineers. So the next question you would ask yourself is, what kind of culture produces those structures? And I'll leave that as an exercise to you guys. Only so much time. Example 2. Your app has several serious customer-facing incidents over the last year. You're doing retrospectives diligently, but it doesn't seem to be making a difference for reliability. So we talked a lot about finding those highest points of leverage, so our ideal retro process should be designed to do just that. So my favorite version of this is called 5 Whys. The goal here is to identify the root cause for whatever failure you're experiencing. You start with the observed effect, you ask why, and you keep doing it until you feel like you've reached the root cause. Once you find the root cause, you can talk about action items and next steps. Let's look at a quick example. Our site is suffering a 2-hour outage. Why? We shipped a bad config. Why? A new hire didn't understand the config format. Why? We don't have docs. Why? Every team uses a slightly different format. Why? We believe it's important to give teams as much autonomy as possible in their technology decisions. Interesting. That seems like a really great thing to me, right? So the thing that I really love about 5 Whys is it's a great way for employing systems thinking as a group. That exercise we just went through, we were actually just exploring all the parts of the system that are proximal to the failure. In other words, what parts of the system are directly related to that failure and indirectly related. And once we do that, we actually understand all the options, all the failure modes much better. If you do this sort of thing diligently, you'll understand not just what parts of the technical stack are contributing to failure, but also what parts of your culture are contributing to failure. And if culture is one of those factors that are limiting your growth, it's paramount to understand when to change. In case you're curious how that performs over time, confusion and mistakes rise steadily, but so does autonomy, because goodness is staying constant, at least in this system. Might sound familiar to some of you. So I want to talk about what happens when you don't retro carefully, and there are 2 systems patterns I'm going to cover. The first is the fixes that fail pattern. So in this pattern, you encounter some problem symptom, and you land a really quick fix, but then the long-term consequences basically undo that work that you did. So in this case, we hear about some performance concerns, we lazy load. Short-term that helps, long-term it hurts app reactivity. This is a very common thing. In this particular system, this is what we see. A lot of effort, but performance complaints don't end up going down. That's the fixes that fail pattern, and that's what happens when you ignore parts of the system. Sounds familiar? So the second pattern I want to highlight is called shifting the burden, AKA addiction. I'm going to shift away from tech and use a different example. So let's use caffeine as an example. So you're feeling fatigued, you pick up a cup of coffee. Short term, you get that energy burst, you get through your day, awesome, but you haven't actually addressed the root cause of the problem. Is it lack of sleep, poor diet, not enough exercise, something else? Caffeine isn't actually a solution. So you can take this, replace caffeine with the useless refactors, or the other measures that feel good short term, but aren't actually solving the problem. And if you just spent your time on the long-term solution, it takes a little bit longer to see that payoff, but ultimately, just like putting down that cup of coffee, if you sleep instead, you'll feel a lot better. And this is how this system behaves over time. Coffee consumption goes way up, dependency goes way up, fatigue goes down, but so do healthy lifestyle habits that could replace coffee. And this is something that's happening to many of us today, right? Okay, so I'll close on this. I want you all to ask yourselves if you feel like your retros are serving you well. Are they producing lots of incremental low-impact fixes? What fixes do you feel like have been failing you? And finally, what tactics do you feel like your org might be addicted to? So we just covered understanding your systems for greater impact. We talked about employing different modes of thinking depending on the problem. And finally, we talked about the long-term system dynamics of product quality. That's my time. Well, one more thing. Next time you encounter a lingering product quality problem, instead of asking, how do I solve this problem? Try asking yourself, what thoughts, beliefs, and values do we need to adopt to ensure the behavior that we desire? Thanks, everyone.